Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's Let's Talk About. And today we'll be doing just that. Backed by popular demand, we will be talking about the province's Adult Protection Act. And I'm looking forward to another great session on the Act. Before we move on, I just want to cover a few brief housekeeping tips with you. I will ask Steve to take his slides down for a minute so I can put some up. Thank you very much, Steve. Anyway, to get on with our housekeeping tips, please mute your mic to block out any outside noises. And we've got captioning going on at the bottom of your screen. Any questions or comments made during the presentation, if you would put them in the chat box, that would be fabulous. And then when we finish the presentation, Vanessa is going to tell us what's there. And this session is being recorded, as they all are. And lastly, but very, very importantly, if anyone has any ideas for a presentation that they would like us to put on at some point in time, please let me know. Just drop me an email or a phone call and let us know what you'd be interested in hearing. And now, before we move on, I'm just going to pause for a few minutes so we will let Barb acknowledge the lands that we live on. Barb.
Okay. We respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has now been erased forever. We also acknowledge the island of Uktahunguk as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. And we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan and the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and the Inuit of Nunatuavut. We recognize all First Peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome.
During pre-COVID days, staff and volunteers here at Seniors NL, and oftentimes with our partners, we spent a lot of time traveling around the province, giving presentations, facilitating workshops and training, and bringing seniors together to share information and learn from one another. Before events began, we often had asked our audience to fill out a survey. And one of the questions we asked frequently on that survey was, do you think elder abuse is happening in your community? The no responses were dominant every time. Well, elder abuse, including neglect, both neglect at the hands of another and self-neglect, is alive and well in Newfoundland and Labrador. At some of these events, even though everyone denied that there was elder abuse going on in their communities, people would come up to us after the event was over and quietly tell us that they were afraid or worried about someone whom they thought was being abused, but probably didn't even know they were being abused. And today our guest speaker is going to talk with us about a piece of our province's legislation intended to offer protection to a portion of the population that who are considered to lack the understanding necessary to recognize that they are being abused or neglected. And I am now very pleased to present Steve Ross. Steve is a registered social worker from Bishop's Falls. He has a bachelor's and master's of arts in political science and a bachelor of social work from Memorial University. And Steve has worked as a social worker with Newfoundland and Labrador Housing and with various community centers throughout the St. John's area. Since 2019, Steve has worked with the department, and he is now Policy and Program Development Specialist, Adult Protection, the Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development. And on that note, I will take my slides down, and we will have let Steve come on and give us his presentation, his views of the Adult Protection Act.
Thank you, Mary. And Tanya is going to share the slides.
Yep. Okay.
Excellent. Well, good morning, folks. Pleasure to be here this morning, and many thanks to Mary and everyone for having us this morning. Hope you're getting sunshine wherever you are this morning. As Mary noted, my name is Steve Ross. I'm a registered social worker and the adult protection consultant with the Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development. Joining me this morning is Tanya Sullivan, who's the newest addition to our team here in the department. I'm going to pass it over to Tanya for some intros as well.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tanya Sullivan. I'm also a registered social worker. I'm working temporarily with Steve at the Department of Children, Seniors, Social Development as a policy and program development specialist.
Thanks, Tanya. So, folks, we're here this morning to provide an information session around the Adult Protection Act. So the goal with these sessions is to really provide folks just a sense of the functioning and implementation of the Act. So generally, we try to touch on all the key areas of the program, the kind of what it is and how it works. That'll be the focus this morning. As we're going through the session, I think one area that will certainly come up quite often is the concept of capacity. Capacity is very much the backbone of the Adult Protection Act, we would say, and really ties in with the kind of the service principles and overall spirit and approach to the Act. So certainly that's something we're going to focus on. And we're also going to talk about abuse, neglect, and self-neglect, of course. So as many folks joining the session this morning know, abuse and neglect, of course, can take many forms. And I think it's important that I was to highlight that as we kind of continue to raise awareness about the Act. Folks may also be aware that a 5-year review of the Act was completed, and the Act has undergone some legislative updates in the fall of 2021. So we'll briefly touch on some of those updates to come moving forward at the end of the session as well. So this morning's session is really going to cover the Act and the process as a whole, and as well as some of those updates as well. In terms of time, I think I believe we have an hour and a half, I believe. So the session itself should be approximately, I guess, probably around 45 minutes to an hour, and then we can have some time at the end for questions and discussion. In terms of our agenda, first, we're just going to provide a brief overview of the Act, so that'll kind of provide some general information to set up the remainder of the session. Second, we're briefly going to discuss some of the service principles in the Act. So those principles kind of really form the foundation of the adult protection process, we would say. So I thought it would be helpful to touch on those as well. And third, we will touch on the criteria for what it means to be an adult in need of protective intervention. So that's a really important piece, because obviously it'll speak to really the application of the Act. And that can sort of bridge us into a discussion around abuse, neglect, and self-neglect. And then we're going to chat about, of course, the concept of capacity. As we mentioned, capacity is really central to adult protection, and we could spend hours just talking about that concept in and of itself. For our purposes today, we'll just kind of provide a brief overview of the concept and highlight some of the things to be thinking about, as well as highlight kind of how it's assessed under the Adult Protection Act. And then we're going to jump into the adult protection process. So in adult protection, we have a 3-step process. So that includes reporting, evaluation, and investigation. So we're going to kind of walk through each of those steps. And then finally, we'll clue up with some discussion of the 5-year review of the legislation and kind of provide a tops of the trees overview of some of the changes that are included in the updated Act. So and then we'll kind of cool up with some questions and discussion. So with that said, I will pass it over to Tanya, who's going to kick us off with some touch on the overview of the Act.
Okay, so the intent of the Act is to protect adult residents of Newfoundland and Labrador who are at risk of abuse, neglect, and or self-neglect, and who do not understand or appreciate the risk. It applies to all adults over the age of 18 years or older in the province, and it applies regardless of their living arrangement. So it doesn't matter where they live. It can be in community, long-term care, personal care homes, the streets. An adult protection report can be received by a regional health authority social worker, manager, or director, or a police officer. There has been a provincial toll-free number established for reporting. You'll see the number on the slides. It's 1-855-376-4957. And this is regardless of where the adult lives in the province. That number can be used. The current Adult Protection Act was proclaimed in 2014, and it replaced the Neglected Adults Welfare Act, which had been in place since 1973. The Act is operationalized through 4 regional health authorities, so Eastern, Central, Western, and Lab Grenfell. RHA staff are responsible for the screening of reports, for completing evaluations, and for conducting investigations. The Department of Children, Seniors, and Social Development, CSSD, is responsible for legislation and administration of the Act, which includes the development of policies and procedures and monitoring the adherence to policy and procedure and evaluation of the Act. The Provincial Director of Adult Protection, who is Henry Kiley, also functions as a decision maker for adults who are declared to be in need of protective intervention, where it is required. And as I said before, reports can be made by anyone to a social worker, manager, or director in the various health authorities. So if you call the 1-877 number, your call will be directed to the appropriate health authority that the adult resides. As Steve said, the concept of capacity is central to adult protection, and a lack of capacity must be suspected for the Act to apply. The adult protection process has 3 steps: report, evaluation, and investigation. All reports that meet the criteria will be evaluated pending the required consent of the adult. If consent cannot be obtained, the regional director is advised and a decision is made whether to proceed to an investigation. Both evaluation and investigations are assessments, with the big difference between the two being that an adult must consent for an evaluation. However, in investigation, consent is not required. And we will discuss these 3 processes later in the presentation in more detail. The Adult Protection Act is considered last resort. Regional health authorities and CSSD are mandated to take least intrusive and restrictive available means to support and protect adults. When a decision is made to move forward with an application to have an adult declared in need of protection, RHA and CSSD staff must demonstrate that every attempt to reduce the risk in a least intrusive manner has been explored. So it is an act of last resort. And now I'm going to pass it back to Steve.
Thanks, Tanya. So folks, the Act, as I mentioned, does include 7 service principles. And these principles generally just kind of guide the Act and the associated regulations and policies and procedures. And I often say these are really important because they kind of form the foundation for the interventions that take place under the Act. So I thought it would be helpful to really discuss these before we get moving through some of the other material. So I can run down through these briefly. So the first there, every adult has the right to live their lifestyle of choice. So that principle is going to come up again later, but important to note that, of course, all adults do have that right to live their lifestyle of choosing. Of course, that's not something that will be just not unique to just adult protection, but of course, I'd say society as a whole. And as helping professionals, family members, neighbors, friends, citizens, I think we all want to make sure, of course, that all adults are living with a good quality of life. But of course, also important to remember that all adults have a right to self-determination when they understand and appreciate risk. So, and we'll touch on this one again, but important to note that at this point, as it is a big piece of adult protection. The best interests of the adult must be at the center of all interventions. So I think, determining whether a service or a program is in an adult's best interest really does involve a pretty thorough professional evaluation. I mean, that would include evaluating a person's safety, health, and well-being. It could be their physical, emotional, and psychological needs. It could include evaluating their relationship with family or significant others. It could be a person's cultural and community connections, or an adult's past and present wishes or feelings. All of those things would need to be considered when intervening in any way under the Act. And that underlying concept would guide the work to the greatest extent possible. And every adult has the right to be involved in decision-making. So in adult protection, there is a lot of emphasis placed on engaging the adult throughout the process to the greatest extent possible. So this could be constantly informing the adult of the purpose of the process and all their options. It could be supporting the adult to participate in a capacity assessment. It could be supporting an adult in designing their service plan, for example. So all adults have that right to be heard to the greatest extent possible in adult protection, and folks are always striving to ensure that the adult is supported to do that to the greatest extent possible. And every adult, of course, as Tanya alluded to, has the right to the most effective but least intrusive form of support. So clinicians involved in the adult protection process are always looking for opportunities to mitigate risk, really with as little disruption to the person as possible. And any restriction on a person's decision-making rights, of course, is an extremely significant intervention. And as Tanya highlighted, would really only be done as a last resort when all other options have been exhausted or are required due to risk. So for example, if risk can be mitigated through the provision of services in the community or by supporting that person in developing a safety plan, those options will be pursued before folks take more intrusive steps, say with a court order, for example, or any of those other more intrusive steps. So that least intrusive lens is always applied under the Act. And the intervention should be specifically designed for the individual. So again, we're looking at what intervention is in the person's best interest. How can folks mitigate risk in a way that supports this individual, maximizes their autonomy and really aligns with their wishes, their preferences, and of course, their specific needs. Family ties and contact should be preserved when appropriate. So depending on that case, that could be appropriate. But of course, we can also imagine scenarios where maybe an alleged perpetrator is a family member. I think, sadly, in many instances of abuse, particularly in instances of senior abuse, family members and folks close to an adult are often the alleged perpetrators. So again, we need to look at every case individually, but where appropriate, those family ties should be preserved if it is in the adult's best interest. And lastly there, folks, if an adult desires, they should be encouraged to obtain support and advice from family and friends in decision-making and assistance with communication. So at any point in the adult protection process, an adult has that opportunity to have support and assistance with decision-making and communication. So if an adult wishes a support person, for example, to be present during a capacity assessment, that will be encouraged. In addition to that, it could be even a person to support their understanding of a particular part of the adult protection process. Again, the spirit of that is really to ensure that the adult is supported to the greatest extent possible throughout the process. And I think that is really in recognition that I think, that decision-making and capacity, of course, can be expressed in various ways. And a person's method of communication, of course, with others wouldn't be grounds for deciding that a person is incapable of making decisions. So again, that supportive lens is very important in the adult protection process. So those are the service principles, folks. Those principles are really, as I mentioned, really intended to kind of guide the overall approach under the Act and kind of really captures the spirit of the Act as a whole and kind of how it's practiced. So I'm going to pass it back over to Tanya now, who's going to cover the criteria of the Act.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so an adult in need of protective intervention lacks capacity, and there are two doors they may enter through to meet the criteria to be an adult in need of protective intervention. So first, they must be incapable of caring for themselves, or refuse, delay, or is unable to make provision for adequate care and attention for themselves. Self-neglect. Second, or they are abused or neglected by someone else. And this applies to all adults regardless of their living arrangement. So as I said earlier, it can be in community, long-term care settings, personal care homes, other residential settings, or someone who doesn't even have a home. And here's some definitions. So abuse is the deliberate mistreatment of an individual who lacks the capacity to protect themselves, or is reasonably likely within a short period of time to cause serious physical, psychological, or emotional harm or substantial damage to loss of assets. And it also includes intimidation, humiliation, and sexual assault. So physical abuse occurs when someone uses a part of their body or an object to control a person's actions. So some examples of physical abuse would be hitting, pinching, hair pulling, arm twisting, strangling, burning, pushing, slapping, beating, shoving, anything physical to a person's body. Psychological abuse occurs when someone uses threats and causes fear in a person to gain control over them. And some examples of physical abuse would be threatening to harm a person or his or her family if she or he leaves, threatening to harm oneself, threats of violence, threats of abandonment, stalking, criminal harassment. Those would be examples of the psychological abuse. Emotional abuse occurs when someone says or does something to make a person feel stupid or worthless. Some examples of emotional abuse are name calling, blaming all relationship problems on their partner, spouse, using silent treatment, or not allowing the person to have contact with family and friends. So that's just a few examples of different types of abuse. Neglect is the failure to provide care, assistance, guidance, or attention to an adult who lacks capacity that causes or is reasonably likely within a short period of time to cause serious physical, psychological, or emotional harm or substantial damage to loss of assets. So neglect occurs when someone has the responsibility to provide care or assistance for someone, but they don't do that. So some examples of neglect will be failing to meet the needs of a person who is unable to meet those needs alone, abandonment in a public setting, not remaining with the person who needs help, so just leaving them on their own. Some of the physical aspects of neglect would be just disregarding any of the necessities of daily living for the client, personal care, food, all of those things. And medical would be not ensuring proper medical care. So if someone was not to seek the proper medical care for an adult, would be considered neglect. And substantial loss of the adult's real or personal property, including financial assets. So that would be the financial neglect. And self-neglect is the failure of an adult who lacks capacity to take adequate care of himself or herself, where the failure causes or is reasonably likely within a short period of time to cause serious physical or psychological harm or substantial damage to loss of assets. So some examples of self-neglect include living in grossly unsanitary conditions, suffering from an untreated illness, disease, or injury that within a short period of time is likely to cause physical or psychological harm, and they're not getting the help that they need for themselves. They're suffering from malnutrition to the extent that without intervention, their physical or mental health is likely to be severely impaired. Creating a hazardous situation that will likely cause serious physical harm to adult or others, or cause substantial damage or substantial loss of an adult's assets. And we do need to be cautious in terms of self-neglect of personal biases and values when we're considering this concept. Because as Steve said earlier, under the service principles, an adult does have the right to self-determination and live the life of their choosing, providing they have the capacity to do so. I'm going to pass it back to Steve.
Awesome, thanks, Tanya. And so, folks, I think Tanya covered the piece around the abuse, neglect, and self-neglect. And as you mentioned, a lack of capacity would also be a requirement for coming under the Act. And I think it's always helpful to kind of open up with some general thoughts on kind of why capacity is such a critical component to adult protection. And again, I think Tanya's points around self-neglect really spoke to that importance of the idea that, again, all adults, of course, have that right to live their lifestyle they're choosing, and particularly make choices that may be considered by others to be, say, unwise or not great decisions. So, and we often say in adult protection that the quality of a person's decisions are not indicative of their ability to make those decisions. And so really the idea around that is that, of course, we had to be cognizant of the idea that folks are free to live in accordance with their own values. But of course, there could also be times when someone could be at risk of harm and are unable to understand and appreciate that harm. And that really speaks to, I think, the importance of the concept of capacity, and that, and really the purpose of the Act as a whole, in that really a person's self-determination and a right to make decisions is, of course, deeply respected in the Act, but as is that need to intervene and support folks who may not understand or appreciate the risk of a particular decision. So I think really as a whole, the concept of capacity is really interconnected with both, I guess, a person's right to self-determination and really those broader pieces related to respecting a person's rights and their autonomy, while of course at the same time also having processes in place to support folks who may lack capacity with respect to a particular decision. So always helpful, I think, to highlight those pieces. So what is capacity? So in adult protection, it refers to a person's ability to understand information and decisions concerning their healthcare, physical, emotional, psychological, financial, legal, residential, or social needs, and appreciate the reasonable, foreseeable consequences of a decision or the lack of a decision. And we'll touch on this further, folks, but adult protection, we're really talking about a person's ability to understand and appreciate a specific risk at a specific time. So if an adult was experiencing self-neglect and appeared to be at risk of harm as a result, from a capacity perspective, folks will be looking at, does this person understand and appreciate this risk? Does this person understand information regarding the situation they're living in? And do they appreciate the consequences of that situation in respect to their health and well-being? So further to that, though, there are a number of key concepts related to capacity that we can highlight. So as alluded to in some of those previous discussions, a person's capacity is very much recognized to be decision specific. That is, it is recognized that capacity can exist in one area or in respect to one decision, but not another. For example, a person may have the ability to make some financial decisions. However, maybe there are some challenges with healthcare decisions, for example. Or someone may have the capacity to manage their finances, for example. However, they may lack capacity in areas related to independent living. So as noted, we're really looking at what is a person's ability to make a specific decision at a specific time. And related to that, it is recognized that capacity is very much on a continuum. So it's not an all or nothing kind of on and off type concept. It is recognized, I guess, that there are almost degrees of capacity, and folks can be more or less capable in respect to particular decisions. So you'll sometimes hear folks make the comparison of a light switch versus a dimmer. So there, of course, there can be degrees of shades of capacity rather than this kind of global concept where someone's considered to be competent or incompetent to make particular decisions. And I think that's in part as well because capacity is recognized to be fluid. A person's capacity, of course, can change. It's not something that you would acquire and it's kind of absolute. And really in recognition of that, not only can capacity be reassessed under the Act, but adults that are declared to be adults in need of protective intervention do have their service plans consistently reviewed to ensure that any changes in capacity will be met with any changes in a person's status, for example. Another important idea to highlight related to capacity, folks, that capacity is not defined by a diagnosis or a disability. So for example, an individual with a cognitive impairment or an intellectual disability, for example, could potentially have challenges in respect to particular decisions. However, that diagnosis does not imply that or mean that can be assumed. And of course, while that diagnosis or a particular disability could inform an assessment of capacity, its presence wouldn't be grounds, of course, again, for determining someone lacks capacity. And I think really important to highlight, folks, even that same principle, we could even talk in the context of age. So I know Henry presented on, did a session with you folks on ageism a couple of weeks ago. And again, I'm sure he spoke to the idea of that broader impacts of ageism and that broader, I guess, societal tendency to kind of link age with decision-making ability, and kind of that broader, I guess, paternalistic approach to age. And so I think certainly important to link that idea that capacity wouldn't be defined by a person's age, and highlighting the relevance of ageism kind of when we think about the right to self-determination and respecting people's choices regardless of their age or a particular diagnosis. So, and also important to highlight as well, folks, that capacity, of course, can be influenced by temporary factors. So, for example, a person could be experiencing a mental health episode. They could be impaired due to substance use, for example. They could be impacted by a lack of sleep or the time of day, for example. There are a number of temporary factors that could impact a person's capacity. And in adult protection, we would say those factors will be resolved to the best of our ability before kind of proceeding with a broader formal capacity assessment under the Act, which I'm going to touch on here coming up. And again, that's really in recognition that while those factors could impact a person's capacity in the present, folks could be supported or treated, and a person's capacity could potentially be restored. So again, really important to kind of address some of those potential temporary factors in adult protection. So. And finally, folks, thought it would be helpful to really highlight the process that can be used in adult protection to assess capacity. So in adult protection, we do have an interdisciplinary process. And under the adult protection regulations, 7 professions are identified as being able to assess capacity under the Act. So that includes social work, speech language pathology, nursing, physiotherapy, psychology, occupational therapy, and medicine. And that process, folks, we always say is used because it is recognized, I guess, that the best capacity assessment is really a thorough one involving the adult and a team of professionals. So where possible, that process would be coordinated by a social worker. And generally before that process begins, folks, a risk will normally have been identified. And generally, a lot of the options to kind of mitigate those risks have been attempted. And that assessment kind of becomes necessary if the adult appears unable to understand and appreciate some of the risks. The social worker would then identify the appropriate professions to include in the process, which again will be dependent on the area of risk. So, for example, if there were some risks around a particular areas of personal care, the social worker may reach out to, for example, occupational therapy, say, and medicine. The team would then come together and identify some of those decisions of risk to be assessed. And then following those assessments, a discussion will be held to determine whether the adult is capable of understanding and appreciate the specific risks being experienced. So I guess a general point on that, folks, certainly a new process and relatively unique. I mean, there are many other pieces of legislation in the province that speak to decision-making and capacity, but may assess capacity differently. So I think there is, at the same time, recognition of the benefits of the process, excuse me, as the interdisciplinary process, as various professions can certainly contribute and really enrich that assessment process. And I think recognize that it's not one area where one particular assessment tool can be used. I think it's recognized that capacity is very much a complex concept, and that various professions can certainly collectively enhance the process with all their with those discipline-specific lenses that can be applied to the process. So, so that is, I guess, in a nutshell, folks, kind of a quick overview of the interdisciplinary process and capacity as a whole. Overall, I think certainly a complex area of the program for sure. But at its core, I think it really is about a person's ability to make a particular decision and recognizing how connected that is to a person's rights, and really challenging ourselves to reflect on some of our own perceptions and biases in broader society around, I guess, decision-making ability and age, for example, or decision-making ability for folks who may have a particular diagnosis. So I think always important to highlight those pieces. So with that said, I'm going to throw it back over to Tanya, who's going to discuss the adult protection process.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we're going to talk about reporting a little bit more. So the number again is up on the screen. It's 855-376-4957. So as I said before, a report can be received by a regional health authority, social worker, manager, director, or by a police officer. Every report that is accepted is evaluated, and a report can be screened out if it doesn't meet the adult protection criteria. So there is a screen out process. If we refer to the police, if criminal activity is suspected, and there's no action against a reporter who acts in good faith, and the level of risk is assessed by the social worker initially, and the response to the report is determined in accordance with the risk continuum guidelines that we use to assess that risk. If a situation arises and you are unsure whether to report or not, then make the report, because then the social worker would assess the report to determine if it meets the criteria for acceptance. So reports can be made anonymously and confidentially, so you can make them without giving your name, but if you do give your name, then confidentiality of that is respected, and it's only just would be disclosed in rare circumstances, for example, if it was ordered by the court or something like that, but we do try to respect confidentiality to the fullest extent possible.
And just to jump in, Tanya, I would add too, I think you made a great point that in terms of some of those risk level pieces. So every report that is received, folks, is given a risk level, and that risk level would then range from extremely high to low, and the level is going to in part kind of determine the response time. So if folks receive the report, for example, that an adult clearly lacks capacity and was being physically assaulted, for example, that would likely be an immediate response and would also likely refer to police as well. Sometimes folks, though, in many instances will get a report regarding potentially related to some more self-neglect pieces, in instances where it could be given an alternate risk level. So just wanted to kind of speak to that piece around linking the report, the nature of the report, to the risk level and the response time that it's given. So
Thanks, Steve. And when you make a report, the social worker may call you back to clarify information or ask a question, just so they gather the information, the most information to determine the level of risk that they're going to be dealing with. So the other thing with reporting is that privacy and confidentiality doesn't allow information to be shared with the report source regarding the action that was taken by the health authority after the report is made. So sometimes report sources call back and ask about the specifics of how the report information was dealt with, but because of the privacy and confidentiality mandates of the health authorities, that information can't be given after the report is made. So that's the basic reporting process. So once a report is accepted, then we move to the evaluation. So basically, the social worker who receives the initial report completes the evaluation as follows. It may not be the social worker that receives the report, but it is the social worker who will complete the evaluation. So some of the first steps is to interview the report source. If at all possible, that will be a first step. And then interview and or observe the adult who may be in need of protective intervention. And that's a really important step in the evaluation process. And also during the evaluation process, you're assessing the level of risk. For all three steps in the adult protection processes, risk is being assessed continuously. If criminal activity is suspected, we are going to refer to the police. We're going to gather as much collateral information with the consent of the adult in the evaluation phase to determine the risk. And then at the end of the evaluation assessment, there are three possible outcomes. So there could be that the adult has capacity and that there is no risk identified and there will be no further involvement, and that would end the evaluation process. The adult may have required professional or supportive services, and it was provided to them, which reduced the risk, and no further action would be required under adult protection, or it may warrant, the evaluation may show that there are high risk and there's evidence to suggest the adult may lack capacity, and the recommendation could be to proceed to an investigation. So in the evaluation phase, consent of the adult is required to do any of these steps. In investigation, so we move to investigation. The investigation is completed at the request of a regional director or designate if consent could not be obtained from the adult in the evaluation phase. So the regional director would recommend it move to investigation. So in investigation, we're going to continue to assess risk. We're going to refer to police if criminal activity is suspected. And in investigation, we do not require the consent of the adult. So we are able to do all of these steps without the consent of the adult. However, we do try to involve the adult to the greatest extent possible during the investigation phase. So we're going to review records and gather information. We're going to interview the adult who may be in need of protective intervention, if that is possible. And it's in the investigation phase that a capacity assessment, which Steve just spoke about, is usually coordinated. And it is coordinated by the social worker. And it's interdisciplinary, as Steve just previously discussed. So at the end of an investigation, there's also 3 possible outcomes. Again, no further involvement. So it was determined that the risk is low and the adult likely has capacity. And so there's no further involvement. We're going to provide professional or supportive services to reduce the risk. Or we're going to make an application to the court for an order to have an adult declared an adult in need of protective intervention. And at that time, a service plan will be developed with the adult to ensure that an adult is protected. Did I leave out anything, Steve? Do you want to
No,
add?
I think that captures it. I think that last step, again, folks, in terms of, I guess, declaring an adult need of protective intervention, again, as folks could appreciate, very much a last resort option, occurs very infrequently, as folks are able to often mitigate risk, of course, in much less intrusive ways. So, for example, maybe a situation, it could be a substitute decision maker comes forward from a healthcare perspective, or maybe a support person comes forward in someone's life, or maybe the person implements a safety plan or accepts some supports and services. So folks are always looking for those opportunities to mitigate risk and kind of park the adult protection process. But as Tanya highlighted, in the event all of this would be exhausted, no options remain, an application, of course, could be made to bring the adult under the care and custody of a director. Would also highlight as well, folks, that there are emergency intervention provisions under the Act. So in the event that there was someone's life was at risk, or they were facing imminent harm, folks can take steps under the Act from an emergency intervention perspective to remove an adult to a place of safety. As well as there's some other components there related to court orders to facilitate investigations and what have you. So.
Thank you very much, Steve and Tonya. That was fabulous. And now, everyone, we have a good 40 minutes left in the session for questions and feedback. I do want to let everyone know that everyone who registered for this session will be sent the link to the YouTube recording of the session, as well as the slides that Steve and Tonya used, if Steve and Tonya are okay with that.
Of course, of course.
And yeah, so I think I'll hand it over to Vanessa now, because Vanessa has been monitoring chat for us. And Vanessa, you can start with the questions in chat.
Thank you, Mary. Let me just scroll up to the top. There are some questions coming in. One question was, can an individual support person be present during formal capacity assessments to assist the individual as needed?
Absolutely, folks. I think, as we mentioned, it's embedded into the service principles under the Act. And again, I think it's a great question, because I think it really does speak to those situations where folks are trying to be supportive as much as they can during the process, a piece of which could include absolutely including a supportive person. We often speak about, I guess, the concept of spokespersons in adult protection. And again, that speaks to that idea of a supportive person who can help that adult communicate their particular understanding or appreciation of a particular area of risk. So that's a great question, though.
Thanks, Steve. Another question was, can you speak to any specific amendments that have been made to the adult protection legislation and how they are integrated in practice?
Sure. Yeah. So folks, a 5-year review was completed on the legislation in February 2020. The folks that was supported by the folks at the Newfoundland Center for Health Information. And I think coming out of that, to address a lot of the feedback provided by some stakeholders in the review, as well as some of the legislative matters, a new act has been developed. That updated act is expected to take effect sometime later this year. And the nature of the updates, though, I would say really a continuation of the spirit of the current act, in that the updates are really intended to, I would say, enhance the rights of adults involved in the adult protection process, and at the same time, though, strengthen some of the protections for adults who might be in need of protective intervention. So really, those changes are intended to ensure that we kind of are continuing to meet the mandate of the Act, of course, and protecting some vulnerable folks that might be come under the Act, but at the same time upholding their autonomy throughout the process to the greatest extent possible. So just some tops of the trees things, folks, that we've mentioned would be, as I mentioned, the rights of adults was a big piece in the review. So there have been some provisions included in the Act, so including the right to legal counsel. There have been some time limits placed on some particular orders, and some additional provisions related to the review of declaration orders. So again, all processes that again speak to that kind of rights-based lens. There's also the Act also includes the addition of a service principle that speaks to the preservation of an adult's cultural and community connections. So again, I think while cultural considerations, of course, are already a key component in the practice, that addition, of course, will ensure that those considerations are really embedded in the legislation kind of moving forward. And again, there's some other pieces there related to the Act does create some new temporary orders. Those orders are really intended to kind of strengthen the protections for adults, but at the same time, on an interim basis, but at the same time, include some of those rights-based pieces that I spoke to. And there have also been some updates as well, folks, to the definition of an adult in need of protective intervention. And that the updates to that piece really is around the concept of decision-specific capacity. Again, very important in adult protection, as I mentioned. So the definition has been kind of tweaked in that recognition that folks may be capable in respect to some decisions and not others. And there's been some corresponding changes made to the declaration orders under the Act as well, to provide folks some additional flexibility around some of those conditions that can be included for an adult who has been declared in need of protective intervention. So sort of a tops of the trees, I guess, piece to speak to with some of the updates, but certainly when before the Act, the updated Act is put into place, we're looking forward to coming around and doing another fresh batch of sessions and some education and training on the Act. So certainly looking forward to that for sure. So,
thank you. Another question, does referral to police move it out of the APA, Adult Protection Act's responsibility? So once that's, you reach out to the police, is that in their jurisdiction now, I think is the question, or do you still work with the individual?
No, a great question. And Tanya, feel free to jump in on this one. I think the big piece with that would be to highlight, folks, is that the Adult Protection Act is a civil act. But as folks can appreciate, there could be many instances where a report is made or an investigation is completed where there is a suspected criminal activity as well. So, for example, you can imagine that will be in instances of financial abuse, for example, or if someone was physically abused. In many cases, that could involve criminal involvement. So I think I think those parallel investigations would often occur concurrently. Essentially, I guess would be the short answer to it. We don't have, say, for example, any memorandums or anything like that in place with police, but it's often folks would collaborate to the greatest extent possible, as they're the focus might be a little bit different, but folks are of course working together to kind of address those specific allegations. So, Tanya, not sure if you had anything to add on the police piece, or
No, that pretty much sums it up, I think.
Thanks. Another question came in. How does the Act apply to young adults and or persons in long-term care who have developmental or cognitive challenges and are unable to speak on their own behalf?
so I would say, if for any reason, I would say to folks that the Act applies regardless of applies to folks of all ages. As you mentioned, the majority of the reports that are received in adult protection do concern folks 60 plus. In fact, I want to say in the first 5 years of the Act, to brush up on my stats, and I believe we're looking at about 80% of the reports received in the first 5 years concerned adults 60 years and older. We do, of course, however, receive reports on younger adults, and the process would look very much the same. I think if there was an allegation of abuse, neglect, or self-neglect, and there was a suspected lack of capacity, people would engage with the process as they would with any adult that comes in engaged in the process. And again, all that supportive lens and those other pieces that we discussed earlier would apply. So certainly, I think while the Act applies, again, regardless of someone's age and living arrangement, of course, we do see the majority of the reports related are to older adults, but still applicable to younger adults. Always helpful to highlight that. So,
Thanks. What type of professional or supportive services can be provided? So this would be, I guess, for an individual who might be deemed to have capacity, but I guess to mitigate risk, I believe is the question.
So
Yeah.
you go ahead, Tanya. Yeah.
So there's several different types of services that could be offered to an individual if they had capacity and required support. Anything from our home support service program under the community support program, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, referral to mental health and addictions. Anything else, Steve, that?
No, I think you touched on it. Could be placement. It could be an application for placement, home support services, those type things. I think the big piece to highlight will be that if a person didn't meet the criteria under the Act, like many other health services folks, those programs and services will be voluntary. And again, that kind of touches back to that piece around that we spoke to earlier about, I guess, that right to live, that right to self-determination and make live your lifestyle of choosing. So certainly that wouldn't prohibit from folks offering those supportive services, but of course we'd be mindful that in some instances folks may not wish to participate in certain programs or services. But at the same time, I think, Tanya, that definitely certainly speaks to some of the typical ones that folks would see for folks that would be could be an adult in need of protective intervention, but a big piece would be all that great work that gets done at the regional health authority level and kind of supporting folks with those programs and services. So, yeah.
Thank you. Another question was, what specialized training do the 7 professionals have who are determining capacity? In some provinces, there are specialized capacity assessor training programs and certified and insured capacity assessors. Are there any plans to do this in Newfoundland?
No, a great, fantastic question, though. I think a couple of things. So we are in the process of looking at the regulations for formal assessments under the Adult Protection Act. Are anticipating that will, in many respects, speak to the process we currently have. And in terms of the education training, the hope would be, again, we have some great folks that are involved in their individual professions that provide a great expertise in their particular area. And we're also hoping to this coming fall with the or later this year when the updated act comes on board, hoping to certainly roll out those other pieces related to some education and training around the capacity pieces as well. So nothing in terms of like, I guess, a standardized piece that the question kind of alludes to, but certainly I think that is top of mind. And how do we kind of support folks with the work in recognizing that it is certainly recognize that, you know, we're all on a kind of a learning curve with this in this particular area. But folks at the same time are really crafting some discipline specific expertise in the area. So certainly lots more work to come in it, but and exciting for sure. Tanya, not sure if you had anything to add on that piece related to the assessments or?
No, I think that sums it up. It is a work in progress for sure, but lots of learning have happened over the last 5 years for sure.
Absolutely.
Another follow-up question, I guess, to build on that is a school guidance counselor in the same category as a specifically trained assessors listed earlier in the presentation?
So typically, if that person was working in the area of adult protection or in the healthcare system as a whole, I should say, and they were listed as one of those professions, absolutely, they could participate in the formal assessment. Again, that's often determined by that coordinating social worker, who of course would have a connection to the particular case at hand and would be in a position to kind of work with others to kind of determine which folks to involve in the assessment. But I guess from if a profession was named in the regulations and were involved in the case, folks could certainly be involved in that process for sure.
Great, thanks. I believe that's all the questions, but if I'm after overlooking anything or if anyone has any follow-up questions, please either write it in the chat or actually, I think I have one more coming. Yeah. If you have a family member who is an abuser or who has also served as a support person to the individual during the formal assessment, how do you determine who is being truthful if the individual is afraid of the repercussions? If he or she exhibits fear of the abusive support person during the assessment?
No, fantastic question. Tanya, feel free to jump in. But again, folks, often cases that wouldn't be the case, of course. If someone was an alleged perpetrator, folks will be looking to engage with that adult on their own to have a conversation about some of those pieces. Anything to add to that piece, Tanya, though? I think.
Yeah, if that were the case, we will be looking to speak with the adult, if possible, privately. Or we would be trying to determine if there is another support person that might be available to be with the adult. If they could identify someone, we would ask the adult if they wanted someone else present. We would certainly be trying to do it with the adult and someone different than the alleged perpetrator.
For sure.
Yeah, to build on that question too, it was asked, what if the abuser was never identified as the abuser? Like it could be kind of going on behind the scenes and that type of dynamic, because we do see that sometimes people might step forward to connect with services, but behind the scenes there might be some coercion or some ulterior motives or
Sure.
different things play out, right?
I would say to that, I mean, in that evaluation investigation stage, the folks would do a really pretty thorough overview of some of the allegations that were being made and some of the support persons in that person's life. And again, I think while we emphasize that piece around that supportive lens today in the adult protection process, of course, at the same time, folks are going to be cognizant of how that intersects with, say, an alleged perpetrator or someone in that person's life. Again, as we kind of touched on earlier, and I think you kind of see it in all the stats, in many cases, folks that are the alleged perpetrators are folks that are close to the adult, unfortunately. So I think that is something that folks will be mindful of when kind of going into these processes for sure. So.
And the other thing with that piece is that we can only assess based on the information that we have available to us. And we're going to certainly do our best in the assessment phase to attempt to identify, but at the end of the day, there may very well be times that we may not be able to identify the alleged perpetrator for whatever reason. But we're going to do the best that we can, but we can only do what we can based on the information that we have available to us.
There was a follow-up question. How do you identify the support person in that scenario?
In that particular, well, I think in broadly speaking, folks, I think folks are engaging with supportive persons in the person's life. That's really kind of the essence of the process. So it could be a support person in their life. It could be a substitute decision maker. It could be it could be someone that they're close with in their life, say a potential caregiver. But again, I think that would all come through the process in terms of when folks are doing the evaluation investigation of being mindful of what the allegations are, and folks that have been identified by the adult as someone that can support them in the process. Again, I would suggest that there's nothing in terms of that it would define a spokesperson in terms of having to be a particular family member or those type pieces. I think the goal of it is to really put the adult in a position where they can be supported to go through the process. And again, in recognition that capacity can be expressed differently. But of course, also recognizing, again, finding that balance, because of course, there could be times, as we mentioned, that where the alleged perpetrator is that person who's close to the adult. So again, I think it would certainly involve a pretty thorough evaluation, investigation of the situation before folks are kind of going through that process. So,
and just to acknowledge that it can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to, I guess, to find that support person or to decipher between all of the information that you've received, and certainly engaging the adult to the fullest extent possible in terms of trying to find someone that they identify as knowing and trusting. We would just have to go on that at that point.
Thank you. Any other questions for anyone in the chat? I think I covered them all, but if there's anything else that comes up, just let me know.
Vanessa, I just want to jump in here for a minute. I want to let people know that some of those questions, while they were in the chat box, they indicate that they're coming from Seniors NL. They were questions that some of the registrants asked before when they did sign up for the session. Okay, so we
fantastic.
just put their names in there. I just start to send them off to Vanessa.
All good. And don't hesitate though, with that said, Mary, like, please, I mean, folks, feel free to reach out, any questions or comments after the session. We love getting feedback on these sessions. Happy to discuss anything further for sure. So
yeah. Anybody have any other questions or comments to make to Steve and Tonya before we clue up things here? I'm going to ask Steve to take down his screen now, and I'll just put up mine again for a few final remarks if nobody has anything. As we indicated in the invitation, and when you register, if anyone needs a certificate for the session as part of your professional or post-secondary education, please let us know and we will send it off as quickly as possible. And we do have the Newfoundland and Labrador Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, okay? And that was started by Seniors NL and is a very important part of Seniors NL. And it's the information on that is on Seniors NL website, and it's we have an email listserv, and we do have webinars and other events. And the Newfoundland and Labrador Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse helps to connect those working to address and end elder abuse in Newfoundland and Labrador. If anyone wants to become a member, please let me know. Membership is free, and you will receive any information that we have coming in on elder abuse, not only from the province, but from across the country and some information on elder abuse internationally as well. We also have Friends of Seniors NL, which we give people business cards to distribute to seniors or people who care about seniors in case they need information or referral. And the business card has our numbers here so people can just call them, call in themselves and get any information that they require about programs and services. And I think that's it. If anybody, any last call for final comments and questions, anybody?
I would just add to Mary, that thanks again for folks joining, and thank you to Mary for having us, and certainly look forward to coming back in the future, especially with the later this year with the new act and things are coming out. Happy to come back and have another session for sure.
Perfect. And whenever we get our hands on this new act, I'll be sending that out to people too. Make sure
Okay.
everybody knows about it.
Fantastic.
Anything when that's going to be made public?
So the act is available. The act that was acclaimed in the last fall is publicly available. So I can certainly share that, Mary, if that would be helpful when I share you with the slides.
Wonderful. Okay, everybody. Thank you so very
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, folks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good summer and please stay safe out there.